Rand. Are you looking for new accommodation in a place that doesn't mind the fact that you support the slaughter of Jews, that you're a jihadist, that you want the state of Israel wiped off the map? Well, Australia invites you to relocate to their lovely country, and your pro-Hamas views are, quote, not a problem. Welcome to the Daily Objective. This show is not actually sponsored by the Australian Immigration Department, but yeah, they have taken an interesting turn there recently. Yeah, it seems that Australia gave 3,000 visas to Palestinians since October 7th. They're temporary visas. They're not full relocation packages, but it was somebody in the government who said nobody would send anybody back to Gaza right now, which of course means they won't send anybody back to Gaza. The leader of the opposition in Australia said that there is a security risk letting in people from Gaza who support Hamas, and has been called a racist because, of course, that is typically the left response to people who show some concern about things. There are racists out there, but you can't identify them by listening to the left on who's racist because everybody other than them typically is. James, are you considering relocating to Australia anytime soon? There's a growth in their diversity at the moment. I'm not sure you would contribute. You count as a contribution to diversity, by the way, but
No, I wouldn't. I didn't realize Palestinian was a race. It's a funny thing. Palestinian, if I'm critical of the culture, if I'm critical of the ideas that are dominant among Palestinians, I'm a racist? No, we know what the ideas are that are dominant among Palestinians. We know the vast majority of them support October 7th. We know Hamas is more popular in the West Bank even than in Gaza. But the point is that the when you do that, we recently did an episode with man on the street episodes, man on the street interviews with ordinary Palestinians. If that is at all a representation of their views, then they are danger. They're dangerous to have in your country. Egypt doesn't want to take in the Gazans. Jordan doesn't want to take in Palestinians from the West Bank. No, they want it to be a problem for Israel because these people have a racist hatred of Jews. That's what they're taught from the time they're children. That it's a glorious thing to martyr yourself in the cause of killing Jews. And these are, in fact, dangerous people. Now, legally, I put my lawyer hat on for a second, Razi. The question is, should ideology be a restriction to immigration? My general principle would be no. No. If someone has a strange religion or a strange political view, whatever their opinions are, should generally not be a consideration in immigration. People have a right to move about. That is to say, peaceful, rights respecting people have a right to move about. Now, during wartime, of course, this changes. This changes dramatically. And it seems to me that during wartime, it is perfectly reasonable to keep out, for ideological reasons, the people who support the ideology of the country or the group of people with whom you're at war. If we do not treat what's going on as a war, which the world has been eager to evade, no matter how many acts of war Hamas perpetrates, no matter how many acts of war their sponsors, Iran, perpetrate, we're not going to treat this like a real war. But if we were treating this like a real war and Israel as a real ally, then during this time of war, our support for Israel would mean that we would have a legal right to keep out the people fighting, killing Israelis engaged in October 7th. October 7th is plenty of justification for the civilized nations of the world to give their full support to Israel. And that means keeping out these dangerous, violent people. Now, it's not a question of race. It's obviously not a question of race. It's a question of ideology. These people want Jews dead. They're taught that from the time by the UN, by the way. They're taught this from the time they're just small babies, so toddlers, that it's a noble thing to kill yourself in the cause of destroying Israel and killing Jews. So,
well,
well, yeah.
Well, you say that they want Jews dead, but from what I hear from Australia's leaders, it's the story is quite different. And here's specifically, so this is from an article in the Sydney Morning Herald. The person we're talking about here is the Director General of ASIO, which is, as far as I can tell, like the FBI of Australia. This is Mike Burgess. Well, I'll read from the article. Burgess, who last week raised the national terror threat level from possible to probable, said that providing financial support or material aid to Hamas may be a problem for Palestinians undergoing security checks as part of their visa application process. It is a different matter if people are expressing support for Hamas because they, quote, want their homeland, he said. And the quote continues, if it's just rhetorical support and they don't have an ideology or support for a violent extremism ideology, then that's not a problem, Burgess told ABC's Insiders program on Sunday. Yeah, Hamas, just want their homeland in a sense that they make very clear what they mean when they say they just want their homeland. They want to exterminate the Jews who are in their homeland, what they call their homeland. They want the Jews out. They want the Jews dead. They've said it. So if you were expressing support for Hamas, what exactly are you expressing support for that doesn't involve the extermination of the Jews? And Mike Burgess doesn't explain that. And of course, when he's criticized, the critics are called racist. But yeah, this is Australia is far away, and I know we have many viewers there who probably aren't watching live because it's sometime in the middle of the night there, but they usually watch the recordings. But we don't talk about it often. But yeah, they're far maybe geographically, but they're not that far, let's say geopolitically from what many in the West, how many in the West seem to approach this war.
Well, exactly. And if their own law enforcement officials are saying that there is a probable, an increased risk, they've gone from possible to probable. I don't know how they assess this evidence, but if their own assessment is that there is a danger of violence within Australia because of this, then rhetorical support would be meaningful if you're really a supporter of Israel. You make the really good point, though. Supporting Hamas rhetorically is to support an ideology. I mean, this distinction they're drawing is absolutely bizarre. They just want a homeland. Well, what their homeland is a function of what your ideas are, what your beliefs are. In any case, Hamas has controlled Gaza for some time now. It's not a question of them not having a homeland. If you think it's a question, if October 7th was a question of having, quote, a homeland, then you want the destruction of Israel. Plain and simple. No, and Hamas, any implicit support, any implicit sanction for Hamas is an ideological stand for violence, is a very, very violent ideological stand. But again, it comes down to the fact that we're in a semi-war, you see. It's A and not A at the same time and in the same respect. We're both allies with Israel, who is at war against a vicious enemy, and we're not going to treat it like a war in many respects. It's not really a war there's no war against Iran, and we sure don't want any escalation there. However many acts of war, however much real war has been going on for the last 4 decades between Iran and civilization, that's not a war. We don't need to treat it like a war. And even in the wake of October 7th, rhetorical support for Hamas is not a violent ideology, apparently, even as the risk level of terrorism increases in Australia. This is what you would call intellectual incoherence. Intellectual incoherence. These people can't, they haven't made up their mind, as I say, about whether this is a war, whose side they're on, and so they end up sanctioning true evil. And if violence comes to Australia, it will be their own fault.
Yeah.
The government's fault. My friends in Australia, if there is Islamic terrorism in your country, blame it on your government.
Yeah. By the way, Australia is well known for being very strict on immigration, very strict on refugees. They've done some really I think, terrible things with refugees, putting them in, detention camps in Nauru where they're gone for years, and yeah, not all refugees are created equal. If somebody actually has to be punished for some crime, sure, put them in a detention center in Nauru. But just by the fact that you try to come into a country, that's pretty extreme. But yeah, if you're a Hamas supporter, quote, not a problem. Paul says,
You're also the best tennis player in the world, and you haven't had your COVID vaccine. We don't let you into the country. So we want to get really strict about a tennis match when the guy hasn't got a COVID vaccine. But when it comes to people who overtly support Hamas and want Israel destroyed, well, that's just rhetorical, and we can let them in. It's not really an ideology. We're not really at war, etc. So they sure can be strict when they want to be about immigration. The tennis player didn't have his COVID shot. But when it comes to Hamas supporters, now, even though the terrorist threat level is increasing, well, that's no big deal. That's how Australian government logic works in this regard.
um,
I put logic in quotes.
Paul says, I'm considering relocating to Tel Aviv. Let me quote the President of the United States. Don't. You're not safe in a country surrounded by savages who want to wipe that country off the map if that country refuses to defend itself, which Israel unfortunately is. So, yeah, that is my recommendation. Bonnie says, Sinwar may be vacationing on the coral reef. Well, I Googled it. Rats can swim up to 3 days, so he could be, I don't know if that's enough to get there, but
Oh,
maybe.
rats are good swimmers. It's biological fact. Yeah.
Uh, all right, let's read some more of this article. So after he says that's not a problem, the quote continues. If they have a support for that ideology, then that will be a problem. That ideology being, so the previous quote, I'll read it again. If it's just rhetorical support and they don't have an ideology or support for a violent extremism ideology, then that's not a problem. That very much sounds like off-the-cuff statements. But then if they have a support for that ideology, then that will be a problem. And now the article very nicely continues and says Hamas, which has governed Gaza since 2007 and organized the October 7th attacks on Israel that led to an estimated 1,200 deaths, is a listed terror organization in Australia. Again, this is the person running the FBI equivalent of Australia, inviting terrorists into the country. That's I would be scared if I was in Australia. I'd be a bit less scared if I were Paul and considering moving to Tel Aviv, because maybe some of these terrorists are just gonna go to Australia where the head of their FBI equivalent is inviting them to join them.
Well, see, that's just it. I mean, the Houthis, recently killed a man. Hezbollah is sending missiles. So where am I safer, in Sydney or Tel Aviv? I'm not sure right now. The threat level has been raised, and they are talking out of both sides of their mouth, out of the Australian government. As I say, it's A and non-A. All you are is pro-Hamas because you want your homeland. That's not an ideology. On the other hand, a rhetorical support for the violence, that is an ideology. No, the two are the same. Any support for Hamas is a support for October 7th. That's what they're for. That's what they're about. That's what their purpose is. They systematically planned the atrocities. The atrocities were on purpose. They happened at every location where Hamas invaded, where the Gazans invaded southern Israel. Every single location. This was the plan. Hamas is a terrorist organization as recognized by most civilized countries in the world. Of course they are. And any support for Hamas should indicate that you are sympathetic with a violent ideology. It's bizarre, the flat contradiction that comes straight out of their law enforcement's mouth, even as Australians are at danger right now from their own assessment, a higher risk of Islamic terrorism. And so what do? Oh, well, if it's just rhetorical support for Hamas, we'll let you in. Thousands can come in. Okay, lovely. No, it's that your safety, which is the responsibility of the government, ladies and gentlemen. Your physical safety is actually the job of the government. Government does a lot of things that it shouldn't ought to do. But the one thing it ought to do and is morally responsible for is the physical safety of the people within Australia. And this kind of contradictory bullshit, it can only put Australians at risk and indeed give much worse even, give moral sanction to Hamas worldwide. The kind of rhetorical and political support they need, they have plenty of in the United Nations, but Hamas is banking on and keeps Israel handcuffed from taking the appropriate actions in response. That's really what this is all about. But you notice the have your cake and eat it too contradiction? Look at Vice President Harris right now. I mean, she had an appearance. There were all these pro-Hamas demonstrators just yesterday who had a big demonstration on the Democratic convention. One of the people arrested yesterday in protesting Ms. Harris was a delegate to the Democrat convention and has had their credentials removed, so they won't be at the Chicago convention next week for the Democrat. Can you imagine? Are there other delegates who might share this viewpoint? I don't want to guess what's going to go on inside the convention hall, much less outside the convention hall with the Democrats. But you'll notice that same have your cake and eat it too attitude. You know, these are terrorists, but not terrorists, is Kamala Harris's official position.
Yeah, the convention is next week, you said.
Yes, sir.
Oh man, we're gonna have to watch it and talk about it. If we don't
Probably
talk
at some
about
point.
pressing enough stuff as it is. Thank you, Bonnie, for the super chat. Bonnie says, a very good point here. What type of Gazan can afford a trip to Australia? It's possible that there are a few wealthy, decent citizens left who are trying to escape, but more likely they're jihadists who know it's time to get out. Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, I don't think the people of Gaza are as poor as we're told, but yeah, the ones who are wealthy are definitely wealthy because Hamas allows it, and if Hamas allows it, they're probably at the very least in their good graces, if not Hamas leadership themselves. I also don't think the foot soldiers. I don't think any of the people who invaded Israel on October 7th can afford that kind of stuff. But yeah, the ones living it up, yeah, they can probably afford it.
This is the very point here. There are Hamas leaders who are living in Michelin top ranked hotels that are not very cheap. You know, stay at the Ritz in Qatar or something. Stay at the.
I do want to add that I read not in this article but elsewhere that some are from Gaza, some are from the West Bank. But yeah,
Right.
the
Yeah. So
population
leaders,
isn't different. It might just be easier to get out of the West Bank.
right. Right, right. But the point is, those who can afford it are the evil ones, almost certainly, who've been skimming off the aid that's been meant for the Palestinian people, but's been taking the aid for their own purposes, or getting supported by very evil places like the Islamic Republic of Iran. So if you are a pro-Hamas supporter who can afford this, you're almost certainly one of the very, very baddest of the Palestinians, mind you, your kind of leadership role in that. So that's the sort of people they're selecting for with this immigration decision on their part. Even though they acknowledge Hamas as a terrorist organization, they're still, even though they acknowledge there's a greater threat risk now from Islamic terrorism, they're going to be letting in people, if it's, just words saying, I support my homeland. Well, that is support for, that's genocidal, that's support for genocide against the Jews, which is the intention of Hamas, which is the intention of October 7th. Hamas has controlled Gaza. Israel has not controlled Gaza for years now. When you say they just want a homeland, my Australian friends, what you're saying is they want to wipe Israel off the map. That is the espousal of a violent ideology all by itself. You got to make up your mind. You can't have it both ways. You can't. A is not A at the same time and in the same respect. And that's exactly what Australia is trying to assert. And I think a lot of Western politicians, like the current vice president of the United States, trying to have their cake and eat it too, which is really what Ayn Rand called putting an I wish before it is. And it is that reality takes a back seat. The real safety of your people take a back seat to the political necessities of the moment as they perceive it. I'm afraid that's exactly the kind of moral cowardice, moral confusion, and outright epistemological contradiction that we're getting from political leaders in the West. And I still include Australia in that group.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if we still include all the other countries, we still include Australia because, yeah, this is not unique to Australia fundamentally. Maybe the specifics are, but yeah, the fact that it's also a bit unique in that people usually in the West, when they are supportive of the Palestinians, they try to double down on this lie that we should somehow separate Hamas and the Palestinian people, which of course is something that the Palestinian people don't do, certainly don't do when it comes to how to deal with the Jews, even if they're not Hamas, even if they're real opposition to Hamas, like they're a part of Fatah, they are with Hamas on the main point of exterminating the Jews. But here he is not doing that. He is naming Hamas and then explaining why in some cases it's okay to support Hamas, and then of course explaining what the context in which that would be okay is, and that is a non-existent context where they just want their homeland, and of course it's not a non-existent context. It just means something that he probably wouldn't admit it means, which is the extermination of the Jews. So if you just support that, but not an extremist ideology, there is no the term extremist is problematic. But there is no non-jihadist part to Hamas's ideology. There's no, it's not about like, okay, I support their levels of taxation or their approach to welfare. It's
No.
it's very much, this is an organization that exists to get rid of the Jews, that has done as much as it can, will continue to do as much as it can, so long as Israel continues to allow it to exist. And
This
yeah,
is this is the group that said after October 7th, we will keep delivering October 7th after October 7th. They have promised more October 7ths. This group, Hamas, officially is for October 7th and more October 7ths. So you can say, okay, well, these atrocities, well, they were not the plan. That no, no. They, after the atrocities, after October 7th, promised more October 7ths. Any support for Hamas, even the slightest moral sanction for Hamas, is to sanction violence and genocide against the Jews. And by the way, obviously they present a clear and present danger to the people in any civilized country. That's the point here with immigration. I mean, if Australia, you deem it that Hamas is a terrorist organization, if you deem that Israel has a right to exist and defend itself, then what you're doing is allowing violent killers into your country, even though you allegedly support the side of Israel. Now, that is a that's a square. You can't shove that square peg into that round hole, my friends. That is a flat contradiction. And if they get violence in Australia, as I say, my Australian friends, it is the fault of your government, pure and simple.
yeah, and of course there would certainly be legitimate reasons to let in refugees from Gaza or the West Bank, even into Israel, if those are people who genuinely are fighting against the mainstream jihadist wipe the Jews off the map ideology. Then I would say welcome them in,
Yeah.
give them status, whatever status you can give them. But this is not what's going on here, and it's certainly not what's going on here when you say they can support Hamas. You are saying the opposite when you say what if they support Netanyahu? What if they say,
Right.
Netanyahu is a great leader. I wish he was also the leader of Gaza. Would that be welcomed? Uh, Susie says they had a chance to make Gaza into a prosperous homeland and demonstrate that they aren't genocidal maniacs. They failed. Well, failed implies that they tried. I don't think
Right.
they ever tried. I think they did exactly what they wanted. I think Gaza is one of those places, certainly up until October 6th, where people very much live their values being the desire to exterminate the Jews and putting all their resources into that. Their resources, and by their, I mean our resources, which we have been providing them. Gaza was the highest per capita recipient of so-called humanitarian aid before October 7th. That's only increasing since then. And of course, this is per capita by the numbers that they tell us of how many people are there, which they say it's over 2 million. Some reports challenge that greatly.
But
Gib
she's
says there
right.
are 600 millionaires in Gaza. I mean, look, out of a population of 2.5 million, of which
A
seven
million
million
people.
are children and 15 million are women, that's not that many. But yeah.
Yeah, that really is a small portion of, and they'd have a whole lot more millionaires, by the way, than other than a few hundred, given their couple million population just in Gaza. But the questioner had it exactly right. I mean, more than 17 for 18 years now. Uh, Israel not only left Gaza, they forcibly relocated Israelis out of Gaza and left it to the Gazan Palestinians to decide. They voted Hamas in, and within a couple of weeks they were lobbing rockets into Israel. The whole purpose and the other people who got votes were no different than Hamas. The vast majority of the Palestinian population supports terrorism against Jews and the destruction of Israel. And the election showed it. Their behavior showed it. There's been no resistance to Hamas among the Gazans. They could have had a much, if they had lifted a finger to make Gaza a peaceful place where people could actually prosper and make their lives better, then perhaps they would have some legitimate claim. All we want is a homeland. But Israel gave you that homeland. Look at what you did. Within days, you were lobbing rockets at Israel, saying they have no right to exist and planning your future terrorism. Uh, it's unbelievable. But yes, they could have had a peaceful, prosperous homeland already many times over. They have rejected that because they would prefer to destroy Israel than to live a happy, prosperous life or have any of their people live a happy, prosperous, peaceful life. Yeah.
Michael says something that we're at the end of the show, so I don't know if you can clarify, but I will read it. You say, you guys are advocating for violating rights based on unpopular speech. If you mean not letting people in when they support Hamas, no, that's a security measure. If somebody says, I want to slaughter all the Jews, I support jihadists, I want to create a Sharia law state, then no, I don't agree with that. Also in war. In war, I would support killing such people. The person who's making a threat in the chat, no, I don't think we're safe. I think we're in a very dangerous situation, and there is certainly a threat to us. What I'm absolutely certain is you, the commenter who's not using his real name and making the threat, is no threat to us. Although I would love to see you try to do something. On that very positive note, James, you are joining
Well,
today's episode of the reality
yes.
show,
Yes.
which is about the revival of the campus intifada. They had a nice summer break, but the president of Columbia University is now out. She wasn't pro-Hamas enough for some of the protesters, so they are now celebrating on the streets, which of course is not surprising. Yeah, I'm unfortunately sure that we will get to talk about them a lot more. Thanks, James. Thanks, everybody, for watching, and we will see you on the reality show in a couple of minutes.